See, we have about 2 more minutes before we start. So if nobody's in yet. Nope, nobody's in yet. All right, we'll start in 2 minutes. See who makes it. All right, it's 11:30. I don't see anybody else signing in. I hope you all got the invitation I sent out earlier. I am going to go ahead and start this because we want to get through all the learning objectives in our 1-hour meeting. So what we'll do for this review is I am going to bring up the course learning objectives, and we will go through those one at a time. And I will kind of do a quick overview. This is what you should be studying from, is learning objectives tell you this is what I should know when I get to the end of this chapter, and this is what we base our exams on, are these learning objectives. So you definitely want to have these printed out. They are listed at the start of each section in your D2L classroom. Hi, Eric. So you have one person logged in. I'm starting right on time, and I'm just going to go straight through because we have an hour for this. If people join in, that's great. If you have questions, I'm going to go through the learning objectives. This is being recorded, so you can go back and look things over later. But if you have any questions, just jump in and stop me and ask those, all right? So I am going to share the learning objectives on the screen with you for each chapter that's covered on Unit 1 on the exam. And I'm just going to go through these, jump in if you have questions on a specific one or if you're not sure of something, but I will just very briefly touch on each of these. So the 6 basic characteristics that define living things. One of the things that's important that everybody knows is that your answers should be the answers that come from the textbook. You can Google what are the properties or characteristics of life, and you can get some different things like living things produce waste or living things breathe. Yeah, well, breathing is a specific thing to get oxygen in and out of the lungs, and that's not something that all living things do. Google is not going to give you the correct answer. Your answers will be graded based on the material and information that's in the textbook. You can't Google during the exam anyway, so that won't help you. But as you're answering the questions, as you're going through the learning objectives, you definitely want to go with what's in the book. And so the properties of life that are listed in our book First is that living things are organized, and those levels of organization are shown in number 3. We start with atoms, and atoms come together to form molecules. Molecules come together to form all the different components of cells, and cells that perform a similar function come together to form tissue. Different tissue groups come together to form organs. Organs that are involved in the same process come together to form an organ system. And then all our organ systems make an individual organism, and all the organisms of the same type are a species. All of the organisms that are the same type or same species within a given habitat are the population. All the different living organisms that live in a given area are the community. And if we add in the non-living components of that community, the air, the water, the soil, we have an ecosystem. And the biosphere is everywhere on Earth that can support life through ecosystems. So pretty much everywhere. So those are the levels of organization. We look for that organization in living things. Second property of life that the book describes is that organisms or living things require materials and they use energy. And so we're going to have to acquire materials. We're going to have to use those to build biomass, to acquire energy. This is a way to describe metabolism. So metabolism is the sum total of all the chemical reactions in a cell. All those chemical reactions get nutrients, use nutrients. They use them to produce energy and to build mass, build living organisms. So we have to get material and use that for energy and building blocks. Living organisms maintain homeostasis. All of those different levels of organization that we just talked to maintain homeostasis. They all have some specific parameters that they operate best within. So communities maintain homeostasis or balance among all the living and non-living members of the community. Populations maintain homeostasis, as we talk about when we get to those other chapters. But really what we're thinking about with individuals in homeostasis is maintaining a stable internal environment. When we're talking about homeostasis, we're talking about physiological responses to external changes or to internal changes that we don't have control over. They're going to happen because the environment changed. So yes, I can put a coat on when I get cold. That's not homeostasis. That's helping to ensure that my ability to maintain homeostasis is not overwhelmed, and that can happen. But homeostasis is when a physical or physiological response happens. For example, I can't control if I get hot, I'm going to perspire, I'm going to flush. As the capillaries open up to get blood toward the surface so I can release that heat from inside my body. When I get cold, I'm going to shiver, I'm going to get goosebumps, trying to generate heat. And those are things that my body is going to do automatically. I don't have control over those, or an automatic response. So when we talk about maintaining homeostasis in individuals, those are physiological responses. When my blood sugar drops, I'm going to break down glycogen to glucose and release that into my bloodstream as long as there's glycogen available. And that's going to restore my blood sugar balance. If I have too much blood sugar, if I ate Oreo cookies for breakfast and my blood sugar went through the roof, I'm going to remove some of that and store it as glycogen in my liver. So these are responses when we talk about homeostasis, internal responses that I'm not controlling. They're going to happen automatically. And then, of course, I can overwhelm them if I don't eat and replenish my supply of glucose. I'm going to wear it out. So there are limits to how much we can respond to and maintain homeostasis. Reproduction and development, all living things have to reproduce, keep the populations going because living things also die. So we reproduce and develop. So for all living organisms, we do different things at different stages of our life. We are not the same through all stages of our life, and that's true of bacteria, all the way through humans. We all have genes. There's a genetic basis to that reproduction, so that we pass on, inherit the same traits that our parents had. And those adaptations, that's our last component. One thing we want to be careful about is not to confuse adaptation with becoming accustomed to something. So in biology, an adaptation does have a genetic component. It's passed down. And adaptations refer to the physical variation due to differences in our genetics. Within any population, there's physical variation in individuals. That variation means that some individuals are more fit. They are more capable of surviving and thriving in that environment. They're better at getting and using energy, space, materials. And so they have excess energy available to reproduce at higher rates than those who are struggling to survive. So adaptation refers to those physical differences, some physical difference that gives you a benefit that allows you to survive, thrive, and reproduce at a higher rate, and pass that adaptation on to the offspring. So adaptations have a genetic component to do with the physical makeup with the phenotype of individuals and variation in a population. So over time, over generations, those with the better adaptations, with the better phenotypes, will reproduce at a higher rate in the population, will become more and more adapted because more individuals will have that beneficial trait. So those are our 6 properties of life. And we covered on all these terms. Let's see, energy, the ability to do work, we get that from the food we eat, metabolism, the sum total of all the chemical reactions in the body. That's how we get and use energy. There are 2 components to that, anabolism and catabolism. So we tend to think of metabolism as how fast I break down my food, but that's only one part. So I'm going to break down my food into building blocks, and then I'm going to use those building blocks to build biomass or to acquire energy. So anabolism is building bigger molecules from smaller components. Catabolism is taking large molecules and breaking them down to smaller ones. These are all things we'll go through in more detail during the term. Photosynthesis is the way that plants are going to acquire food. So that's how plants use solar energy, light energy, and carbon dioxide as an inorganic carbon source to make an organic food source. Homeostasis, we talked about reproduction genes, that's what carries the DNA. Genes are the traits that our DNA codes for. Adaptations we talked about. Evolution is when, over time, those that are better adapted, individuals with better phenotypes that are more suited to the environment, become the predominant type within an environment. So we adapt, we evolve to be best fit to our current environment. Over time, populations change, that's evolution. And that happens through natural selection. Naturally, those who are more better adapted will survive and thrive. So we'll look at all that later in the term. Each one of those becomes a chapter as we move forward. Lorenzo, I see you dialed in. Hello. All right, let's see. Our 8 levels of taxonomic classification. Taxonomy is how we are going to organize, break down our individuals. And the way to remember these, you may have gotten the mnemonic in high school, Dear King George. Now, Dear King Philip came over from Germany swimming. Dear King Philip came over from Germany swimming. It's a mnemonic to remember. Dear for domain, that's our broadest category. All living things can be divided into 3 big categories. You're either an archaea, a bacteria, or a eukaryote. So those are our domain here, and then king is for kingdom. And our, in our three big domains, domain archaea, the kingdom is going to be archaea. In domain bacteria, the kingdom is bacteria. And then in eukaryotes, us, we can divide eukaryotes, organisms with membrane-bound nuclei, into protists, fungus, plants, and animals. Animals we're familiar with, plants we're familiar with, fungus pretty familiar with. Those distinctions are primarily based on how we get energy. Animals go out and eat other things. Plants make their own energy. Fungus break down dead or dying organic matter to release that energy, to acquire their nutrients and energy. Protists is sort of this weird catch-all group of single-celled organisms primarily. They are eukaryotic, but they are always single-celled. The exception to that are the algae. Algae fall into this group. Most algae in the world are single-celled phytoplankton. But we're also familiar with macroalgae, with the giant ones, and they don't have the same structures as plants. So they are put into this group of Protista, but those are primarily single-celled organisms. Those are our kingdoms. And then from kingdom, dear King Philip, phylum. So at each level, we start with all of the eukaryotes. Oh, and then we're going to get to only animals. Oh, and then we're going to get into specific phylum. Okay, for the sponges. And then from phylum, we can go to class, and then from class to order, from order to family, and then genus and species. Genus and species always go together. We can't just give a species name. Species name would be like your first name. So if I was just Lynn, there's lots and lots of other Lynns in the world. I wouldn't know which one. Same species name can be used for multiple different genuses. So genus is sort of like it's going to specify more exactly. So we need to have the genus and the species together. If you remember that mnemonic, dear King Philip came over from Germany swimming. Remember how we go from the biggest domain to the smallest genus and species, and those are organisms that are all similar. Okay, so taxonomy. So you want to make sure anywhere on these, and our learning objectives where it points to a specific figure or a specific case study or something in the text specifically, you want to make sure you know that. Hint, that will probably come up on the exam. Writing a scientific name. Writing a scientific name, this is our binomial name, the genus and species. As I said, we always need to know what genus we're talking about. So we would always have to write the genus and the species. Or I would always have to write Lynn Hinky. And I would italicize that, or Hinky Lynn, genus would come first. Homo sapiens. I would always italicize. Homo is the genus, sapiens is the species name. And I'm always going to capitalize the genus. I'm not going to capitalize the species. Once I've established what organism I'm talking about by writing out completely the genus and species, I can abbreviate by just writing the first letter of the genus. So once I know I'm talking about Homo sapiens, I can now write H sapiens. And I would still capitalize that H, and I would still italicize the whole name. Scientific method. So you want to watch the lab video that I posted if you're unsure about these. You should be able to identify the different components of the scientific method and understand it always starts. What are the steps? We always start with an observation. That observation about a phenomenon raises a question that we answer with our hypothesis. Our hypothesis is our proposed answer to a question. It's not the question. It's our proposed answer. We have no evidence supporting this yet, but it doesn't mean it's just any old thing that we throw out there. We all have experience, we all have knowledge. So we base our hypothesis, our proposed answer on what's our experience. In my experience, in my knowledge, and what I've learned so far in life, or we all have access to Google, to libraries. I do a little background research. From what I've found, here's my hypothesis. If we write our hypothesis as an if-then statement, pretty much tells us how to do our experiment. My example was, if I eat Oreo cookies, then I will get better grades. Tells me what I need to do. Eat Oreo cookies for breakfast. I'm specific about that. And then take tests to see if my grades improve. So that if-then method helps. It also helps to design my experiment, tells me what to do, and identify my experimental variables. My independent variable comes after the if. What I change whether or not I eat Oreo cookies for breakfast. And then the dependent variable comes after the then. It's what I measure, my outcome. My grades will improve. In order to know that that wouldn't happen anyway, I need to have a control group where the independent variable doesn't change. I need to compare a group who's eating Oreo cookies for breakfast with a group who's not. That's my control group, because maybe the grades would have changed in the same way anyway. Data, that's what I record about how my dependent variable changed as I changed my independent variable. And then I analyze that data to get my results. We could say in science that we manipulate that data. Manipulation has a bad connotation in colloquial terms, but we're in science now, so we have precise meanings for those. Manipulate means I'm going to apply statistics so that I can have a concise description of what happened without just having to throw out loads and loads and loads of numbers. I'm going to summarize those numbers with things like the average, the standard deviation, the variation. And then based on those results, I can draw conclusions. So the other thing I would need in here are control variables. You want to make sure not to confuse the control group. A variable is something that can change. I change the independent variable. The outcome, the dependent variable changes because of that. Control variables are anything else that could change the outcome, the dependent variable, other than the independent variable. And in order to make sure that I can connect what happened to my dependent variable to how I changed the independent variable, I have to know that nothing else affected it. So I control or hold constant anything else. Back to the Oreo cookies. What else could change my outcome, my grades? Getting more sleep, spending more time studying, reading the textbook. So all those have to be the same between my control group and my experimental group. Those are controlled variables. They could change. I'm not going to let them. Big one, I will fail you if you use this word wrong. Colloquially, again, we use the term theory when we really mean hypothesis. In science, your hypothesis comes before your experiment. It's your proposed outcome. It gives you a target. It gives you a way to tell. Did my data support my hypothesis or did it not? And we can't support a question. We can support an answer or we can disprove an answer. So my hypothesis is my proposed answer. A theory is after I have performed numerous tests on many related hypotheses, and a theory gives me a predictive model. So from my theory, I am able to go and compare to the real world and say, according to all of these different experiments I've done on all the different hypotheses about how to get the best grades, including how much sleep gets me the best grades, how many hours of studying, which textbook, which instructor. I'm going to test hypotheses on all of those variables. Each one of those can become an independent variable and everything else constant. Now I have a big picture a descriptive predictive model saying, oh, if I do these things, sleep for 8 hours, study a little bit every day in short doses, read the textbook, attend lecture, blah, 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 don't eat Oreo cookies for breakfast, then I will get the best grades. So a theory has lots and lots of evidence, a lot of rigorous testing supporting it, and it has been validated by taking it out to see if it works in the real world. So scientific theory, that word has a very specific meaning, but it's different for how we use that word colloquially. And then principles and laws are things that hold steady, always. Gravity, you don't necessarily have to know. Oh, for sure, gravity, if you know gravity works, we can apply it, and it always works the same for experimental purposes. And principles and laws that describe the physical world. Summarize the major challenges facing science. So the last portion of this chapter talks about biodiversity, loss of biodiversity, extinction and habitat loss, talks about emerging disease, which I think is quite interesting and timely because I also teach microbiology, and something that has been a major topic, not just in the recent past. We tend to think of it as a 2020 phenomenon of pandemics, but for about the past 30 years, microbiologists, scientists, the CDC, government have been planning, the military have all been planning, not for if we have a pandemic, but for when we have a pandemic. So this was not a surprise to most people, shouldn't have been a surprise, but lo and behold, we didn't respond in the best way when we started to dismantle all those agencies, organizations, and plans that were making preparations for this. So you want to read over what those entail. These are just brief, broad descriptions, and then of course our next chapters get into these a little bit more. And we will keep coming back to these topics again and again. All right, that's chapter 1. Any questions so far? Unmute and jump in here. And if not, we'll keep going to chapter 44, population ecology. So we've got our different definitions. So we want to know ecology, study the interactions in the environment, living things, our definitions, habitat, area an organism lives, population, all the individuals of the same species living in a given area, our community are all the living things, so all the different populations that live in a given area. And the ecosystem, we're going to add the non-living components, air, water, soil, and the biosphere, all the different places on the planet where life can be found. Right. Then we talk about how we can describe or how we can talk about population. It's important that we know what's happening within a population, the age structure of the population, the reproductive patterns of the population. And we have to know what's going on in the ecosystem. What are the limiting factors to the size of the population in this area? So before we can get more complex in the community, we don't need that. Before we can start looking at more complex things like how different species interact, we first need to look at one. Then we can add communities, how they interact. In the real world, we don't get to divide these out like that. They always interact, but we can set experiments up that isolate those, so we can first look at one before we combine them and get more complicated. So population density. We talk about density, we're looking at a specific area. So number of individuals in a specific given area. And we can look at the way a population is distributed. So knowing how many individuals are in a given area gives us some information. Are we very, very crowded? How densely, how packed in are we? Or is there a lot of space available? But that doesn't really necessarily tell us all we need to know about that population. We can have different distributions depending on a lot of things. Some depend on the organism. They may have a very specific lifestyle, way that they live. Some depend on the distribution of resources that can determine how or where an organisms, a population, how they're distributed. And flipping through the right now. So the book gives the example of a shrub distribution. And one thing, it talks about how in this particular population, over time, these shrubs change what their distribution is, from clumped to random to uniform. That's not true for most organisms. So some of the things that can determine, so a clumped distribution means that most organisms live in a specific area close together. So there might be a lot of space available, but we'll find them close to each other. And in a lot of cases, that means that's because they live in herds, they travel together, so they're clumped together, and they tend to be found where the resources are found. So near a water source, near shelter, so they're clumped around specific locations or in order to be close together. Random distribution isn't often found, but if resources are spread fairly evenly throughout an area, so organisms can live anywhere and have all the resources they need, then we'll get a random distribution. So resources are plentiful, they're spread out, there's no benefit to being clumped tightly together. Just go where you want to go. And then that third distribution, uniform distribution, everybody's spread out evenly, so we have the same amount of space. Here, we'll often find resources are fairly evenly distributed. Where you see that distribution pattern primarily is with territorial animals. They need this amount of space to meet all their needs, to get the food that they need, to have enough room for a mate and a litter, and still have space for their wastes to be distributed, and they'll maintain that territory to reduce interest-specific competition. So you find that with territoriality. So you want to know what is going to affect those distributions. So resource availability, limiting factors, like a lack of resources or nutrients or specific things that they need in their diet, maybe space, maybe shelter. Let's see, the rate of natural increase in biotic potential. Rate of natural increase, R, is our value of how fast a population is growing based on birth minus death. So what's the normal background rate of births minus deaths? The biotic potential is what's the most. So under optimal perfect conditions, where the only thing that's preventing further growth is that it takes this long to reach reproductive maturity and then start having offspring at the fastest rate possible. Biotic potential, the fastest rate of growth or rate of natural increase. Populations don't just increase at this level because of limiting factors. Because organisms move, they do die, competition, all sorts of stuff. We need to understand what's the maximum that can happen. And then we can look at what's happening in the real world and try to explain why, look for reasons why. Our survivorship curves, these are going to help us to define what's the biotic potential, what's the rate of natural increase. So knowing what my mortality, normal mortality looks like, birth minus death. So what's the birth pattern? If I just went with birth and didn't know anything about lifestyle, I think the whole planet would be taken over by insects right away, because we're going to have lots and lots and lots and lots of eggs and larvae, and most of them are going to get picked off before they reach maturity, because those are a type 3 survivorship example. And so we can have organisms whose strategy is, hey, I'm going to have as many offspring as I possibly can. I don't care how many of them live, as long as a few get through. The more I reproduce, the more chances I have that a couple are going to survive to adulthood and be able to reproduce using that same strategy. So type 3 survivorship curve means I am going to reproduce like crazy, knowing only a very few organisms are going to survive the entire lifespan that's possible for my species. Most are going to get kicked off right away. So insects are an example of that. Sea turtles are an example. Broadcast spawning fish, corals, things like that are an example of that. Other organisms will put a lot of time and energy into offspring care. They'll have very few offspring, but most of those are going to survive through the average lifespan. And that's a type 1 survivorship curve, like humans. Most humans that are born survive to adulthood, to reproductive age and beyond, to 100% of the lifespan of a human. And then the type 2 is sort of that intermediate that splits those two curves, typically a diagonal curve, because your likelihood of dying is equal at any time in your life, from birth through death. Got an equal chance, and that describes a lot of rodents, birds, smaller organisms. So those are our survival curves, and we need to know which species we have in order to look at what's going to happen to this population in the future. And then we can look at then population growth, how many survive to reproductive age. All right, now they're going to start reproducing. How are they going to reproduce? Each individual has an offspring. The example that I gave in the lecture video, I used a bacterial growth curve because that's easy math. One organism divides, its asexual reproduction becomes 2, those 2 divide become 4, those 4 divide become 8, those 8 divide become 16, 32, 64, on and on and on. And that is called exponential growth. It gives me a J curve when I plot that out on a graph. And I start out with a very slow, because I have 2 to 4, 4 to 8, those are the numbers. But then all of a sudden 64 turns into 128. And start getting steeper and steeper, and I can describe a J with that, and that's exponential growth. I should know the term semiparity and heteroparity, and that refers to how many reproductive events do I have during my lifetime. So am I going to reproduce once and die? Have a single reproductive event, or itero. So if something is iterative, it happens again and again and again. So I can have multiple reproductive events throughout life. So I have to know how that's going to happen while I'm figuring out my growth curve. And then regardless of which of these, once I know my numbers and how those numbers can increase, what typically we see with any population is we can't sustain exponential growth forever. We're going to hit limiting factors. We're going to hit something that's going to prevent us, the population, from increasing. And that number where we can't increase beyond that is called carrying capacity. The habitat will have a carrying capacity of maximum number of individuals that the habitat can sustain. And what that does to my J curve is it levels it off. So I end up with an S instead of a J. And that's logistic growth. As I approach carrying capacity, once I'm near that line of this is the maximum number of individuals that this habitat can hold, can sustain, well, if I reproduce and get one more, then something is going to limit resources, space, waste. Something is going to kill off another organism, and I'm going to stay right at that level. So carrying capacity, and then we can have different factors that are going to affect carrying capacity. And that carrying capacity is not a set number. We can shift it a little bit based on differences. We reduce the number of, if we reduce the nutrients available, the food source available, it's going to lower our carrying capacity. Let's say the conditions are really low for whatever our prey is, and we have lots of them, that's going to increase our carrying capacity. So there is some movement within that. But aside from carrying capacity, things that are going to affect where that is, we can look at density dependent and density independent factors that will affect where that carrying capacity is. That will affect our population size, how big it can get. Density dependent factors are things that will change based on how big the population is. So competition, the higher my population within a given area, remember we're talking a given area, so there's a set number of resources, I have more individuals of the same species, we all need the same resources, competition gets more intense as I get more individuals in that space. That's a density dependent factor. Predation, as my numbers get higher, I become easier pickings for my predator. My numbers get lower, and I can hide a lot easier because I have more space. I'm harder to find. So those are density dependent factors. Disease and parasites. The more packed in I am, the closer I am to other individuals, the easier it is for disease and parasites to spread. So that's density dependent. The food sources, the space available, those are all density dependent. As my population goes up, the amount of those per person goes down or per individual, and so they affect that outcome. Density independent factors are things that can control population size. It doesn't matter how big or small that population is. A hurricane goes through, lots of animals are going to be wiped out, whether they have a high population density or low. Flooding, so natural disasters tend to follow in density independent factors like forest fires, hurricanes, tornadoes. Let's see. Got two life history patterns. These are related to those survivorship curves to some pretty great extent. You can see which one is which. My R-selected populations are considered opportunistic. That R, my birth rate, my intrinsic birth rate, this is my strategy. Pump out lots and lots and lots of offspring, loads of them, very low parental care. No, a lot of them are going to die. But the more that I have, the more chance I have of them to survive. So those are R strategists or opportunistic species. Weeds are opportunistic species. That picture on page 839 figure 44.14. Again, if you see a specific figure or page number referenced in these learning objectives, make sure you go to that. So there's little or no care in these opportunistic species. They just want to get in there, take over as much as possible, with as great a number as possible. A few are going to survive, and we're going to do okay. K strategists here, we're looking at equilibrium species. That K is for carrying capacity. The population, they're going to try to maintain it at a nice level where we've got enough, we've got what we need, not too much, we'll come from right here. Tends to be larger individuals that have a lot of parental care, longer gestation periods, longer lifespan, and these are more adapted to a stable environment. Again, so I said this earlier, in case anybody missed it, your answers are based on the exam, questions, answers. These are based on the learning objectives that are based on our textbook. So you can Google and find answers. They are not necessarily the right answers. If you Google, we use properties of living organisms because that's an easy one. If I Google what are the properties of living organisms, you can get lots of different answers. We can word those 6 things that the textbook talks about slightly differently. Acquiring and using energy. Some websites, some Google searches will equate that with producing waste, which yes, living things produce waste. Living things breathe, not all living things breathe, that's the oxygen. The 6 that are correct on our test will be the 6 that are in the book. So make sure you go to where we're referenced in the book to answer the questions, because those are the ones that are the correct answers. Google can give you lots of answers. Your textbook can give you the correct answers. So let's see. So there's a case study on page 540. What happens when you get your populations that are too large? It talks a little bit about density-dependent factors like ticks, so parasites have an easier time spreading. Food resources become limiting, and you have lots of starvation, so you need to manage those populations because naturally those populations will be managed by predators, except we've removed air and molds and all the things that we normally do predators up here. And then you will definitely want to take a look at page 843 and the comparison between more developed countries and lesser developed countries, NDCs and LDCs. In these graphs on the bottom of that page, compare the populations of 4 countries: the United States, Canada, Mexico, China, and India. And that's the first graph, A. Then they compare consumption of different natural resources. So oil consumption, coal consumption, and carbon dioxide emissions. The graphs give the absolute values for those countries. But if we divide by the per person, divide by population, we see that even though we have a much smaller population than China or India, when it comes to per capita resource consumption, we tend to use quite a bit more. So look at that. Our oil consumption is 7.7 times greater than per person oil consumption in China. Our coal consumption is 4 times greater than coal consumption in India. And our per person carbon dioxide production is 5 times higher than Mexico. So even though we have a much smaller population, our ecological footprint is much larger. So we want to take a look, compare that, understand it's being shown in those graphs. Questions? Unmute. Any questions? Thank you. All right, we'll move on to 44, and community and ecosystem ecology. So our community is all the different species, so all the different populations that live in a given area. Species, all the organisms. Species is interesting because we have different definitions of species. I'll talk about this a little bit more later in the term. We tend to think of all the species as all the organisms that can and do breed with each other, so they can successfully reproduce with each other. So typically same genus and species only. We don't always get that right, which is quite interesting. For example, some whales and dolphins, pilot whales, and bottlenose dolphins. We tend to think of them as separate species, and if we use our biological definition that they cannot reproduce, we'd be wrong because if we put them in captivity together, they can. They just choose not to in the wild. So it's not a matter of they're unable to, they just don't. So species, all the organisms of the same type, same kind that live in a given area can breed. Our species richness, when we define a community, how many different species, how many different species do we have in that given area? And species diversity, we're talking about the distribution of those species? Does one dominate? Do we have similar numbers, or not necessarily similar numbers, because on different places, different trophic levels, we'll want more or fewer. But do we have a good balance between, do we have enough primary producers given the number of primary consumers? Do we have the right balance? So diversity is, we have the numbers in balance. Richness, how many different organisms do we have at each trophic level? So habitat and ecological niche, these have some overlap, so don't get too worried about our habitat is the environment, the space the organism lives in. So here's where the organism lives. Here are the other species around it. Here are the natural resources that occur here. So the habitat where it lives and reproduces. The ecological niche is the role it plays, or the specific thing that it does in that community. So the niche could be where it is on the trophic level. Is it a predator? Is it prey? Some are predators to some things and prey to others. How does it get its food? Is it a autotroph, a photoautotroph? Is it a heterotroph? How does it meet its survival demands? So the ecological niche is more specific. Within this habitat where I find it, what are the specific positions that I could classify it in? Competitive exclusion principle relates to the niche because we can have the fundamental niche and the realized niche. So the fundamental niche, what are all the roles? What's everywhere in this habitat, everything that this organism could possibly do in this habitat? And the realized niche is what it actually does. The realized niche is going to be narrower, and the reason is because within a habitat, within an ecosystem, I do have competition, and I have other species. So this community of other species are going to compete with one another for different resources, and so they're going to limit one another in what their possible range could be. One of the examples that is given is the barnacles, and these are really fascinating. This is a great ecological study, and actually originally Darwin noticed that the barnacles, there were stripes along rocky shorelines that were slightly different colors. And realized that this is because there were two different types of barnacles that lived there. And the smaller barnacle, Famulus, always lived at the higher level. And so they were above the low tide, so in between the tidal range, high tide to low tide. So they were submerged some of the time, but not all the time. And the larger Balanus were always below that, so they were always submerged. So barnacles feed by their cemented in place, and they feed by extending out their series and modified feet. They basically glue their head down on the rock and keep their feet up in the air, and they're photosynthers. They capture food in these feet, and the food comes from the water. So they can only feed while they are underwater when they're submerged. And if they are not kept moist, they will dehydrate, they'll dry out and die. So they have to seal themselves off when they're exposed to air. So at low tide, Famulus are exposed to the air, they have to seal themselves off and they can't feed. So what Darwin wondered, what other researchers have done since is, now, is this distribution because of preference? Because of limitations? Can they not live anywhere else? And so what he did was removed the Balanus in some areas and removed the Famulus in the other areas to see what would happen. When Balanus were removed, families moved down to lower levels, showing that they could live at those lower levels. They didn't want to live at the higher levels. They could live lower, but didn't, because Balanus was there. When Balanus was moved, Balanus never moved up to the higher zones. That was a higher place to live, or a harder place to live. They had to be exposed at low tide, and that was just hard around them. So they never chose to go there. Doesn't mean they couldn't, that they could grow in that area, but if given a choice, they didn't. And so what that demonstrated was that the Balanus's range, their fundamental niche was everywhere from above that intertidal, above in the intertidal zone, as well as below the low tide zone. That was their fundamental niche. They could live in that whole area. Their realized niche, where we actually found them, was only at that higher one because of competitive exclusion. Balanus grow faster and larger, and as they grow, their shell scrapes off Balanus and removes them from the rock, and so they're excluded from those lower preferred areas. The competitive exclusion means that if two organisms, so both barnacles, they have the same resource needs, two organisms exist in the same niche, then one will be better at accessing those resources and will outcompete the other. And so, let's see, I see, put a question in here. Oops. Chicky, if you go ahead and unmute yourself. Oh, maybe you can't. All right, I unmuted. What was your question?
So basically the question was the fundamental niche, right?
Yes.
That's the things that the organism can do. Or
Yes, all the things it can do, what it could, where it could exist and live and reproduce, and all the things it could do in this habitat.
and the realized niche is the one that like its job, like it has to do.
The realized, so fundamental are all the things it could be doing. Realized is just more narrow because it's not living in that habitat by itself.
Okay.
So there are other organisms of the same species it's competing with, of different species it's competing with. There are limitations. So it's limited to a certain area. And competitive exclusion means if somebody else is a better competitor for that niche, they're going to get it. So here's the whole niche. This is the whole area they could live in. Balanus was the better competitor, so it pushed off Balanus to this smaller area. So realized niche is what they actually get to do.
Okay.
Because of other organisms, because of competition.
Okay.
So that competitive exclusion narrows down the niche, the realized, from everywhere they could live to where they can actually live because they're being outcompeted.
Okay.
Resource partitioning is part of that. So what we saw is the resource partitioning of the intertidal zone, where the barnacles could feed. We partitioned that. Well, Thalamus can live in the upper zone, so they live there and Balanus lives below them. They've divided up the areas that they could live so that both of those species can live in that same habitat. So resource partitioning is we're going to divvy things up, because if we're both competing for the exact same resource, one's going to win and the other's going to lose. So the option is for the other one to go extinct in that area, or live in a smaller niche, in that realized niche. So resource partitioning, we're going to divvy up. We might divvy up resources based on when we access them. So one might feed in the morning and the other might feed in the afternoon if we live in the exact same area. Might divide where we access them. So I think the other example is given as the warblers, where we've got lots of different species all living on the same tree, but they've divided up those trees' resources by where along the height of the tree they're going to live. So we divide things up so that we can have more individuals, more species present. Predator and prey interactions. I think this is a classic example in community ecology is the lynx and the snowshoe hare. Obviously, if there's more prey available, then the predator numbers can increase. because they have more food. But if those numbers increase, they're going to eat all their prey, and their numbers will go down, and then the predator won't have food. So we see those two graphs sort of going up and down, the population in sync, a predictable manner where they affect each other. The population of one is going to affect the population of the other. We've got examples of different prey defenses, camouflage. I blend in so nobody can find me. Warning coloration is kind of the opposite of camouflage. It's I stand out to say, like, I dare you. The startle response is when an organism has some sort of coloration, or it's not camouflage hiding them, but it's hiding a part of them or making a part of them look different. So four-eyed butterfly fishes are an example. They have a big spot on their tail in the dorsal area that looks like a big eye. So if you come across this big giant eye, it's like, whoa, that's a big animal. Yeah, no, not really. It also fools predators into thinking that that's the head region, so they'll go attack that. Yeah. You can survive a tail attack much better than you can a head attack. Give an example of the false head. On a lanternfly, it has a big false head, so it looks like a big giant predator instead of a little insect. And then we have mimicry, where one organism who maybe has warning coloration because it is poisonous, toxic, things, something that's dangerous. So its predators learn, hey, avoid that. That is not good. And then other organisms will say, hey, you know what? If we're similar in color, predators avoid us too, and we are also toxic. Or some take advantage, say, hey, look at that, I'm the same color, and everybody avoids me just because they think that I'm toxic, but I'm not really toxic. Symbiotic relationships, y'all did that in lab. So let's see, questions of parasitism, we get a host that is harmed, not killed. Parasites don't want to kill their host because they lose their host. They want to weaken them so the host can't get rid of them, and then they get some benefit from the host, but the host is weakened, so they have an adverse impact. Mensalism, one individual benefits, the other doesn't care either way, not harmed, not helped. And then mutualism, mutually beneficial, both parties benefit from mutualism. Page 857, we want to go ahead and look at the coevolution interactions, talks about social parasitism. We have two organisms that will develop taking advantage through symbiotic relationships over time. They've developed close relationship where they depend on each other. They have an arms, we consider this an arms race a lot of times. Where one will come up with one way to do something, the other will find a way around it, and we just keep excelling. So read that case study. And then ecological succession, we know the difference between primary succession and secondary succession. So primary succession is an example where we scrape down, we're starting with bare rock. We're starting with absolutely nothing. So we're starting with soil exposed rock. After the glaciers retreated, there was nothing there, so we started with bare rock. We're going to get weathering that's going to break that down to soils to provide nutrients so that we can start to get primary producers. And then secondary succession is based on having some kind of disturbance. So if we have farmed land that is plowed out and then we let it go fallow, and organism species, different plants come back, and we go through a very specific progression of what comes back after a forest fire. We have secondary succession. And so usually there's this very specific progression that we go through with grasses first. We don't have enough nutrients, we don't have enough soil for big trees. We start with grasses. As they grow and die, they decompose and put more nutrients in the soil and build more soil. We get so that we can sustain shrubs, and bigger shrubs, and then start to get low trees, and then we get to our climax community, which is pretty stable up to that point. When we change over time, our climax community is going to be relatively stable, actually have lower biodiversity than those in between times as we're progressing through and changing. But to know the two different types, the primary succession and secondary succession. Autotrophs, again, lab talked about trophic levels are autotrophs, self-eaters, heterotrophs, other eaters. Our consumers, different levels of consumers. Our primary consumer, first one is going to eat the plants, herbivores, and then carnivores and omnivores. These can be in any place on a food chain, food web. Detritivores and decomposers are going to release nutrients back into the environment. And then energy flow. So you want to look at that. Figure 45, 16 through 18 just talks about different energy flows. So energy always flows through a system. Solar energy comes in, gets captured by plants. Some of that energy is used for growth. Some is used for motion, for reproduction, for everything the plant needs to do. And some is lost as heat. And then the herbivores eat that, and they use that energy that they got for motion, for growth, for reproduction. Some goes to waste, and some goes as heat, and so on. So eventually, all that energy is used up. We need more energy coming in from sunlight to plants, to herbivores, carnivores, and so on. Nutrients get recycled. So the law of conservation of mass tells us that all of the nutrients, all of the elements that we have, what we have, so those just keep getting recycled over and over and over again. Abiotic factors and biotic factors that contribute to climate change. Abiotic means non-living. So abiotic pH, temperature, minerals, those are all abiotic. Biotic factors are things that have to do with living organisms. So living organisms, the way that biotic factors affect climate change, and we know cows eat grass and produce methane, and that's a greenhouse gas. Yes, it is. Cows would never live at the population and the densities that they do to produce as much methane as they do. We do farm them and grow them at way high densities to provide our meat that we like to eat, because we like red meat. So that's a biotic factor. Organisms in the ocean are a biotic factor that contributes to climate change by removing carbon dioxide. So atmospheric carbon dioxide enters the ocean. The ocean is a carbon dioxide sink, and it's used to build shells on shell building organisms. So I'm going to go through those chemical cycles, talk about the different factors, and about the consequences of global climate change. Look at the data on page 870. Look at global warming. Global warming is one small component of climate change. When we talk about climate, we're talking about global averages over decades. Weather is one day, one specific point in time, very localized. Climate change refers to what's happening on average all over the globe. And all over the globe on average global temperatures are increasing. So global warming, that's one component. Air temperatures are really, really minor. We're going to spend some time studying water in the week ahead. Changing water temperature is really hard. It takes a lot of energy to increase the temperature of water. And yay, humans, we've done that, increased the average temperature in the oceans. And there are a whole lot of related impacts due to that. So if we change the temperature, the way the ocean circulates around the world is thermohaline circulation. It's based on temperature and the density, based on salinity and temperature. And that density causes water to sink in some areas and rise in others, and that drives circulation. As we change the temperature, we change thermohaline circulation. So we say change the distribution of nutrients, increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, leads to a change in pH of the oceans, and that leads to changes in the abilities of those organisms that do build shells to build those shells, because lower pH, increased acidity in the ocean will dissolve those shells. So if you like shellfish, like oysters, maybe not so much. They're going to have a harder time building those shells. So it's a very complex topic. Anybody wants to reduce that to yesterday's weather, you're more than welcome to sound like an idiot. But that is very briefly covered in that, page 870. Conservation biology. Let me see here. I didn't realize that I had to unmute you guys, so. Questions on anything so far? I'm just showing my shared screen, so if you jump in with a question, I don't have my chat box open here, so. Let me see, I guess I can open that. All right. Let's go back here. Chapter 47, conservation biology. I'm so glad some of you mentioned that you like that, because, you know, in high school and previous bio classes, you didn't really cover this, or it's kind of blown off, or, you know, it's, you see it's chapter 47, it comes to the end of the term, so very little time to actually cover this usually. But for most people, relating to chemistry and atoms and molecules and even cells is difficult, because you can't see that with the naked eye. It's not something you think about, or that it's right in front of you all the time. Whereas these population biology, ecology, community ecology, conservation, talking about these global, these macro level topics, that's a little easier way to capture your interest. So I'm glad it has. I'm glad you're enjoying these sections, learning a little bit more about them. So conservation biology, you do want to know the definition. We're looking at biodiversity as a way to conserve natural resources. Biodiversity means all the different organisms that maintain stable habitats. And it includes genetic diversity. So the more diverse populations are genetically, the more variation you have in a population, the healthier and more sustainable it is. It's because if every organism is genetically identical, then any change that adversely impacts one impacts all of them. There's a whole population. Natural selection works on diversity. Some organisms are more adapted, are better suited to their habitat, and so will survive and thrive and reproduce at a higher rate than others. And over time, they will be more successful. So we need that diversity, because we don't know how the environment is going to change necessarily, or what's going to impact an organism. So the more diversity, the healthier we are. Community diversity, the more organisms within a community. Those food, we get food webs, complex food webs that keep things in balance, as opposed to single food chains where we remove any one individual, everything collapses. So the more diversity we have in a community, the healthier the habitat is. Landscape diversity, so the more and different types of landscapes, different landscapes will have similar social structures, so similar biodiversity within the community. And so the more diverse our landscapes are, the more biodiversity we have in those. And then biodiversity hotspots are areas that have lots and lots of different organisms. So lots of community diversity, lots of genetic diversity within that community, and lots of landscape diversity, so worthy of protecting, conserving. And then the direct and indirect values. Easiest way to describe these, direct value is I can get economic benefit from it right away, meaning I can get dollars from this. This has monetary value. So agricultural value, medicinal value, consumptive use value. I can incur some sort of monetary gain from this or benefit. Those indirect values of biodiversity are things like the biogeochemical cycles, the hydrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, the phosphorus cycle. All of those cycles ensure that there are nutrients in the soil so more plants can grow, so organisms can eat, so we can feed. They recycle, so as organisms die, dead and dying organisms are processed to release those nutrients back to the environment. Wastes, what we consider waste, what can be toxic to us, can actually be a nutrient source for other organisms. Dead and dying organic matter, feces. There are bacteria that, ooh, that's a food source. Fungus, that's a food source for me. And in that process, they release those elements back to carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and convert them to usable forms for plants. Fresh water, so vegetation helps to filter pollutants and sediments out of water. So all of those benefits that keeps water clean means we have to do less processing to get fresh drinking water, less expensive. They prevent soil erosion. Without that, we have to riprap it. We have to go nourish the beaches. We have to do all sorts of things that cost money. So these are all benefits that we get from the environment that would cost us money if they didn't occur naturally. But they don't cost us money because they do occur naturally. In the case of ecotourism, you don't have to do anything. We've got great resources. People come to see them. So we get money from that. So tourism can actually fall into both direct and indirect benefits. I think they actually list it. They don't list it in both, but it says in both of them that it can be classified as either one. And then classifying causes of extinction, introduction of species, habitat loss is a huge one, pollution, climate change, and overexploitation. So understanding what those, what some of the threats are to biodiversity. You want to just look over those pages there. It gives you a brief rundown. Let's see. All right, so that gets us through all of the learning objectives, which that is when we design the exams, we use the learning objectives, and then the material in the book that supports those. So any questions on our first 4 chapters? All right, this video has been recorded, so I will post it if you need to go over and review that. But best thing, these are the learning objectives, go over those, and if it has a specific page number or case study referenced on these learning objectives, do know that. The labs reinforce the lecture, and the lecture reinforces the labs, so we use that material to supplement what we've done in lecture, use our lecture material to supplement your lab learning. And good luck on the exam. You can email, text, or call me if you have any other questions.
Would you say that just going over the PowerPoints and reading the book is a good way to study for the exam?
Yeah, definitely reading the book, go over the PowerPoints, and have these, so at the, I don't have my D2L, do I have my D2L here? No, I don't. In the D2L and the content for each unit, you've got the list of the learning objectives. So have those available as well. So as you read through the book, have those learning objectives out so that you can pinpoint and answer those as you go through. And, yeah, read and walk and go through the PowerPoints. That should do the trick.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? All right, thank you. And we'll see you in D2L.